Welcome to Cooking with Dave and Audie. I'm Dave, that's Audie. Today we're sharpening a knife. Alright, today we're talking about something a little bit complex. There are a few ins and outs, but I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible. We're going to sharpen a knife. I think this is very important for professionals to learn how to do. I think it's a valuable skill for people at home to learn how to do. Because if you're going to spend good money on any equipment that you use in your kitchen, the best thing to spend your money on is a good knife. Ask Audie.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, yeah.
And so if you're going to spend some good money on a knife, spend a little bit of time learning how to take care of that knife. And one of these things is how to sharpen a knife, because no matter how great that knife is, or no matter what some marketing guy tells you, eventually knives go dull. And sometimes they take some damage, like this knife we're working on today. So to get started, there are a few terms that we need to go over so that as I get into this, we all are on the same page.
Drink your coffee.
But I did something cool.
Right, all right. Calm down. Hey, you know what? Someone just said, why don't you up your production value? Look at this
that.
board.
A whiteboard. And not too bad drawing skills there.
Dude, we're picking it up.
If you can't tell, this is a chef's knife. There are a few areas of this knife we need to go over, some terms we need to define so that later on as I'm talking about other things, we're all on the same page. Some of them you already know. Things like handle, where you put your hands. Tip down there, the pointy bit. The edge or the blade, that's the part that actually does the work. That's the part that'll cut your finger. The spine, that's basically the very back of the knife. But we're going to be talking about a few other things. One of those things that I'm going to talk about the most is the bevel. The bevel is that polished area along the blade of the knife. It's just behind the blade, and that's where we're going to do all of our work. That's where we're going to be removing material to repair this knife. So when I say bevel, it's that polished area. In this case, it's going to be on both sides of the knife evenly. We're going to talk about the edge and the blade, but that makes a lot of sense to people. We're going to talk about the heel or the return, which is the back part of this knife here, where the blade stops and it goes up into the handle. These diagrams down here are sort of cross-section views of the edge of a knife, and this is basically what we're working with right now. If you imagine this is the edge of the knife coming up to a point here, the edge of it's actually dulled, rounded over. It's been abused a little bit. And in some spots it's actually bent over. The edge of the knife is bent over. So a proper knife should look like that. It should come to a fine point, and that's a proper fine edge. But right now we're working with this. It's rounded over and dull, or it's damaged and bent over, or even in some cases it's chipped and there's a whole chunk sort of removed from it. We need to repair all that. The way we're going to repair the blade, and it kind of looks like this here, is we're going to have to grind and polish both sides of this knife and remove material to bring it back to a fine edge. So we're going to have to grind off over here and get rid of that. We're going to have to grind off over here and get rid of that. There's one other term that I'm going to be using here, and the word is true. So that means this. If this is a cross-section of the blade of the knife, the center of the spine lines up to the blade edge. So there's a center line that bisects both sides of the blade of the knife. And that means that the edge is true in line with the material of the knife itself, from all the way from the back to the tip. And that's really important when sharpening a knife, because if you grind off too much on one side and you sway that one way or another, the knife just doesn't function very well. We want to give you a look at the knife here because it's fairly well damaged. If you come in close, right in this area, you can see a giant sort of chunk of steel. It was basically rusted out of the knife. Can you see it there at my fingertip?
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty well damaged area back here, sort of from about my fingertip there all the way to the heel of the knife. And you can see there's actually chunks missing out of it. And this knife was sort of left damp, moist, not even wet with droplets of water on it, but a little bit damp. And since it's a high carbon steel, it's very susceptible to like water damage.
Right.
That's exactly what happened here. Super common as far as damage on proper knives go.
Right.
And it's not that hard to take care of. But the more you grind a knife, so over your knife's lifespan, the more you sharpen it, every time you sharpen it, you're removing material. So you're sort of shortening the lifespan of proper function of that knife every time you sharpen.
You mean when you're taking big chunks of material away?
Yes, especially
you
in
have
this
to
case,
sharpen
we're
your
going to have
knife.
to grind quite a bit, 3/4 of a millimeter or so in actual height.
Right.
That this knife is going to lose, so we can get rid of most of this damage. We're
Right.
not going to get rid of all of it, but most of it. Bring it back to proper function. So you always want to be judicious with grinding when you're sharpening knives, especially when you're getting fairly good at it. You want to remove as little material as possible to get the proper function back out of that knife that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And as far as most people are concerned, if you take good care of your knives, you never have to do this kind of heavy damage repair. You're more or less just kind of re-refining the blade of your knife. A little bit of polishing brings it back to good performance.
Okay.
You don't lose a lot of material that way. So the tools we're going to use are some stones. We're going to use several different grits, meaning several different sort of abrasion sizes.
What does that mean?
So that means the lower the grit, basically, the faster it's going to remove material. Sort of like sandpaper. The lower grits of sandpaper are so what you start with, and then you move to finer and finer grits to sort of put a good polish on the knife. So this grit here is probably about 120 grit, 200 grit, something like that. Always keep a couple of old magazines around for blade testing.
All right.
Cutting paper is a really good way to test the performance of a blade. It's not the only way, it's not the best way, but it's a good way.
Right.
So we just want to show here, this blade is really dull. It doesn't cut the paper, it tears it. We're going through different grits, and for all of these stones, we're going to lubricate the process with water.
Why?
For two reasons. It's lubrication as far as, moving something coarse against each other, friction. So that friction builds heat, and you got to keep the heat down while you're doing this. This knife is very susceptible to like temperature variation. If you let it get over 150, 200 degrees, it changes the performance of the blade due to it changes the actual steel structure of the material.
Right, yeah.
It sounds like it'd be hard to reach 200 degrees just using a stone, but it's definitely possible, especially if you're using belt grinders and that kind of stuff. There's way more power going into it. You got to be very careful.
Right.
It's easier with stones, but you can still mess up the temper of a knife on stones. So use water to lubricate, and I'm careful not to overwork certain areas all at one time to keep the heat down, and it's just lubrication. We need to work both sides of this knife, that bevel I was talking about, and we need to work it evenly. But I have one dominant hand compared to the other. I'm right-handed. So when I work my right hand, I do better, I'm more efficient. When I work my left hand the other way, I'm less efficient. So I've got to compensate by working a little bit longer, a little bit more on my left side.
That's interesting.
Than on my right side.
I never even considered that.
That way it keeps everything even and
true. Yeah.
Because if you get too far to one side or another, it really messes up the performance of a blade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a certain angle on this knife, and depending on what knife you're sharpening, what its shape is, and how you like to cut, all that kind of stuff, the angle may change. I'm going to do a good all-purpose angle on this knife, which is about 15 degrees, something like that, on both sides. But what I mean here is there's 15 degrees angle between the stone and the blade. So where the blade edge is touching the stone, there's 15 degrees of angle. And it's important that I keep that angle across the entire blade and on both sides of the knife. You can't let it get uneven. You need a pure bevel, and we'll talk about that later on when I get one worked out. I'm going to work the knife on the stone from the heel to the tip, to the heel to the tip, to the heel to the tip for a little while. Do the same thing on the other side, and then we're going to take a look at what we got going on, see how much damage we got removed out of the knife. So I'm just going from the tip to the heel to the tip to the heel. And you'll already be able to see I'm starting to reestablish a proper bevel. on that knife. I got a lot of grinding to go, but we're already making good progress.
So how much water do you want? I mean, what are you looking for when you're adding water?
Okay, well these stones are actual wet stones, so they need to be soaked prior to use. They need to be saturated with water.
Right.
Otherwise they crumble and fall apart. Some stones they call splash and go. You just sprinkle some water on it, they're ready to go. We're going to use some of those later. And some stones call for using oil and that kind of stuff. I highly do not recommend that. Oil can get sort of gummy as it ages. If you got an old stone that you use for years and years, and I use all of my stones for years and years, it gets gummy and it really affects how it performs as far as helping you sharpen your knife. Water is the best way to go. If you're at a hunting camp, you know how a lot of water spitting around. Spit used to be a traditional sort of
Is that right?
lubricant. Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
One thing I really have to focus on is maintaining that 15-degree angle and not changing it, not letting it go up or down, because if I do that, it's going to change the angle that I'm grinding that blade, which is going to throw it all out of whack. It needs to be all true from tip to heel.
Right.
And if I let that angle change, that trueness is going to sway one side or the other going down the knife, and you don't have a good knife if that happens. I can actually tell now that the tip is bent this side just a little bit. Alright, so I'm not looking to grind all of these big pits out of the blade. That would be too much. Basically, I'd be re-damaging the knife in a different way. We can grind most of it out and return this knife to proper function without having to remove this 100%. And I think that's the best course of action in this case. These two pits right here, can you see them?
Mm-hmm.
This one, we're not going to get all the way out. It's a little bit deeper than that one. I'm going to try and get to the bottom of that one and stop there. But I need to come back from the other side to even this work all up. So now is a good time to go to the other side here and start working on that.
We always knew you would never be able to get all of that out on this sharpening, but
No,
over the
yeah.
course you can make it a
Probably the
efficient
next time,
tool.
the next time
Right.
you would put a good sharpen on this knife, you get the rest of that out.
right.
You can tell, just like from my strokes and the sound, I'm much more efficient on this side. It's more natural. It leans towards my dominant side. You see me going back and forth on the stone here? Like I'm working all the way up here, I'm working in the middle, I'm working down here. And that's just so I don't grind too much of one area of this stone. It's important that this is fairly flat
Right.
in order to put a flat bevel on your knife. So I just want to check here how even things are looking. So I can tell, remember I told you that the tip was bent that way a little bit? Because of that, there's a low spot here and a high spot there, and the rest of that is fairly straight. And I can tell because the grind I put on there, it's fairly even right here, and then tall right there, and then
Right.
short right there,
Right.
and then tall right there. So in order to sort of compensate for that, our bevel's not going to look even, but I'm going to grind it even though this knife is bent a little bit. So the actual edge of the knife is still going to be perfectly straight.
Right.
If you can catch sort of the bevel in this area where my finger is.
Mm-hmm.
If you see me push against it, you can see it looks like steel is sort of flaking off of the edge,
Right.
and that's exactly what's happening. And the reason that's happening is because I'm actually grinding this knife down, taking height
Right.
off of the knife.
That reads really well.
And so right at the edge right there where the material is coming together on each side, it's actually going to flake and chip off.
Right.
But then we got to go back and sort of polish that down smooth and even. But we know we're doing good work from seeing that right there. So now I'm going to sort of work back and forth on each side a little bit. We're about done with most of the stock removal we're doing on this knife.
It looks real nice, dude.
Okay, one of the things we need to pay attention to is that the bevel we're grinding is even from heel to tip. Meaning there are no little facets or curves or angles to it, and that's why it's so important we keep the same angle while we're grinding and polishing. So what I look at is you can catch a glare off of that polished area on the bevel from the light. And then I run it from the heel to the tip or from the tip to the heel. And what you want to see is that there are no little facets or angles or different sort of bevels to it. It needs to be one smooth bevel all the way through at one solid angle from heel to tip. It's very, very important. And I do that by looking at the light coming off of that polished area on the edge there. This side looks good. It's a little shallow right here.
Right.
And this side looks good, and it's a little steep right here. But I did that on purpose to bring this point back around. So I'm just going to take 2 seconds, well, 15 seconds, to just even that up. A little shallow here, a little steep there. I'm just going to balance that back out. Alright, we're good to go. So if you look at the edge here, there's a little bit of damage left on it. Right in this area, there's a few little pits, but you can tell we got almost all of that out.
Yeah, it's completely...
Almost all that is gone, and that was one of the more heavily damaged areas right there.
Yeah.
The other really damaged area was this spot here, and you can still see it there. We've got it more or less flattened out with the rest of the blade. Most of the damage is on a side of the knife, not the actual blade itself.
Yeah.
But we got most of it out. So those are basically going to stay there now. Now, all we need to do is sort of refine that polish, refine that edge, and sort of make sure everything's well trued up.
So what does that mean?
So that basically means moving to finer and finer grits to have a finer and finer polish on the knife. And the reason that's important is because the less polished it is, the more it drags on something while you're cutting through it.
Right.
Whether you're chopping wood for a campfire or cutting meat in a kitchen. And so, especially in a kitchen when sometimes you need to make really fine, really precise cuts, like cutting through a ripe tomato. It's a tough skin and a soft fruit on the inside. It's tough to cut if you don't have a great blade. I'm sure most people are familiar with that.
Right.
Cutting citrus is another one with dull knives. You got to sit there and hack on it, put a lot of weight behind it to get it to cut through. We want to be able to just effortlessly cut through things. So I like a very polished edge. I'm not going to polish this one as much as I would one of my own knives. This belongs to somebody else, but we're going to put a pretty decent polish on this. The way we do that is just moving up finer and finer grits. There's one word we're going to talk about we haven't defined yet, and that's burr. And that's basically as you grind one side of the knife or the other, you sort of, you have an edge there, right? And I'm grinding this side of the knife. As I remove material and get out to the edge here, it wants to kind of fold over a little bit. And that's what happens. It sort of looks like this guy here. Looks like that right there. As I'm polishing this side of the knife, it wants to fold over at the edge towards the other side of the knife. In order to make sure we're polishing all the way down to the very tip of the edge of the knife, we need to make this happen over and over again. From one side to the other, from one grit to the next.
So that's the goal.
Yes. It's a good thing when you're sharpening, but it's not a good thing on an edge that's supposed to be done and sharpened.
Used, right, yeah.
But it's important to be able to feel and establish a burr. And what the burr means, essentially, the reason it's important, it lets you know that you've ground or polished all the way out to the edge of the knife, which is where a lot of people, as they're getting into this, really have a problem.
Right.
You grind and grind and grind and grind, but because you're not grinding out to the edge of the knife, you're not doing any sharpening.
Right.
And in order to make a knife sharp, you need to be able to do that on both sides evenly, over and over again through finer and finer grits. So, a little bit finer grit, a little bit less time, a little bit less work. We're just going to start polishing now. And you can hear the difference here in the grits. This is much finer. This is probably 600-700 grit, 800 grit, something like that.
It's way quieter.
Yeah, it has a higher pitch sound to it. It's not so craggly. It actually sounds finer. But I'm just doing the same thing from the hip to heel to the tip, back to the heel, back to the tip, making sure I'm working each area of that blade properly. And we take a look. So, got a good angle, hitting the edge. There are a few spots that need just a little bit more polishing. And basically I'm just working out the grind marks from the previous grit of stone. So I'm just focusing on that spot that needed a little work there. And then I go back to doing full strokes, so I can make sure I'm bringing everything together, one solid, smooth grind on that bevel. Now I just need to make sure that I've got a burr going all the way down that knife. And I do, but it needs a little work. It needs to be a little better than that. So I'm just going to work the whole blade here for a second. Alright, we are good.
You're happy.
I'm just kind of feeling it with my finger. If you run your finger along it, as it's curled over the other side, you can feel it. It kind of pulls on your skin. And then I just go all the way up and down the blade to make sure I feel it everywhere. And I do. I'm good to go. So now we go to the other side of the knife. Do the same thing again. Knock down the burr that's there from that side, bring it back to the other side.
And that's with the goal of just knocking off the very tip of it, or?
You need to build it and then knock it off. Build it on the other side and then knock it off and even everything out. That's the next step. We'll show you how to do that here in just a second. So because the tip of this knife is just bent, just the slightest bit, it's not bad or anything, but just a little bit, it makes it hard to hit certain areas of that tip easily.
Right.
I'm having to focus on that just a little bit extra. No big deal. We know what's going on. We've identified the problem. As long as we pay attention to it, we're going to be just fine. Okay. Now from this side, I've established a good burr all the way down the blade. So we built a burr one side. We knocked it off, built a burr the other side.
Right.
We need to knock that off and bring it back down to everything's got a nice fine edge on it.
Is there a different technique that you use?
So I've been focusing on just one side, get that good, other side, get that good. Now we need to focus on both sides at the same time. So the burr's on this side of the knife at the moment. First thing I need to do is just kind of knock that down. I do that with a couple good strokes. It's basically gone. There's not yet a burr on the other side, which is good.
Right.
Now we just kind of refine that. So you do kind of even strokes each side. I'm going to do 5 or 6 one side, 5 or 6 the other. Some people count strokes and all that kind of stuff. Not that big a deal, but
Right.
evenly on each side.
Don't do 30 on one side and 2 on the other.
Right. And it's really important now that we're doing each stroke from each end of the knife
Right.
all the way through.
Right.
And then always end with single strokes. And that's just to any little bit of weird part that might be left there, just to kind of kill that. So now we're just basically polishing. We're not really doing any further sharpening. Now the more polished this gets, the sharper it's going to feel, better it's going to perform. But we're not actually sharpening now. We are just polishing. Right, so the knife, nicely polished. Took it up to 3,000 grit, which is pretty good, especially for a kitchen knife. I'm pretty happy with the grind on both sides. There's one thing, or a few things left to check to make sure we've done our work properly. And the first thing is just a good, clean, visual inspection. So we were talking earlier, finding the glare on the polished part of that edge and following it up and down to make sure everything's nice and smooth. There are no little facets and curves and that kind of stuff. And I can tell by looking at it that is the case. Both on that side and on that side. So I know that I've got a good grind and a good polish all the way out to the very edge of that blade. But that doesn't necessarily mean the blade is true. That still doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cut that great. Get one more little look-see here. There we go. That's so much more smooth. I can feel it and hear it. So, great example there of there was a little burr left on the edge. Couldn't see it, couldn't feel it. There was no way to detect it. But stropping the knife removed enough of it to really improve the cutting quality. So if you can make little curls like that, little tiny curls of paper, that's a sharp, sharp blade.
That's way better than the blade edge we had to begin with.
Way better, yes. Will actually cut. And as far as, now we know there's a couple rough spots in there, but as far as proper function in the kitchen, won't be any trouble at all. Won't even tell the difference. So I'm quite chuffed with that. I think that turned out real nice. So, why is this important to see, know, learn how to do? Save yourself a lot of money. Extend the lifespan of your most precious tools, and develop a skill that's a lot of fun. At least for me, when I sharpen knives, especially in a professional environment, when I've got lots of knives to sharpen, I can just zen out for like 4 or 5 or 6 hours and enjoy myself. It's kind of peaceful time for me. Maybe that's weird for some of y'all, but it works for me. We're cooking with Dave and Audie. I'm Dave. That's Audie. That's how you sharpen a knife. We appreciate you joining us. If you like our stuff, subscribe to our channel. Leave a like on this video. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you want to see. Tell us what you liked and what you didn't like. Thank you very much. Have an awesome day.